Growing up, I was a really big fan of professional wrestling. It was one of the few things my father and I had mutual interest in, and growing up in Central Virginia meant that the NWA and WCW promotions were right in my backyard quite often. My friends and I would play out the soap opera style storylines in our backyards, and we even went so far as to create championship belts that we would win off of each other in various contests. So it was only natural when video games came out based on the sport, we were drawn to them instantly. In this episode, we will be going over the wrestling games I loved in my youth. I've chosen a mere 10 games to represent the very best across home platforms and the arcade. Some of them so incredibly fun, I still play them to this very day. It's important to note that I have not been a fan of professional wrestling for nearly 20 years, and the games here will not have any modern representation, because, well, I haven't played a game in the genre seriously in that long. I hope you guys enjoy my favorite wrestling games. In 1990, a friend of mine let me borrow Tecmo World Wrestling. Despite being knee-deep in Genesis ownership at this point, I still really took to it and appreciated its cinematic take on the sport. It didn't have any sort of official license for personalities from the WWF or WCW, but the gameplay was so good you really didn't care. At that point it was a real looker too, with solidly animated wrestlers and moves, and an announcer that followed the action at the bottom of the screen. Like many wrestling games back then, the grapple system was initiated by simply walking into your opponent, and then each move came via certain D-pad button combinations. Each wrestler has a ton of moves too, from the devastation of a pile driver to the high-flying top rope maneuvers. There's no shortage of ways to dole out a beatdown. Add in a brutal final boss, 2-player modes, and 10 different personalities, and you have an 8-bit winner that stands the test of time. Early wrestling titles had little appeal to me. While I was a fan of the various TV shows and promotions, a decent video game experience had eluded me until 1987's Pro Wrestling for the NES. Being new to the system and only owning a single game, I discovered this one through a classmate who had let me borrow it. Wow, was it easy to play. The grapple was simply walking into the other guy, and each move came off by simply pressing a direction and a button. It was so intuitive, and each wrestler had their own unique moveset, there really wasn't anything else like it at home at the time. It also had one of the most memorable music tracks in gaming history. The kind of tune that repeated consistently, but had such a catchy flow to it you didn't care. The only real shortcomings to this one was the small roster of wrestlers and the lack of a tag team option. But outside of that, wrestling just didn't get any better at home in 1987. The guy that programmed this for Nintendo went on to do the Fire Pro Wrestling games, another series that's very much worth playing. In 1995, Midway released WWF Wrestlemania, the arcade game. It was essentially an effort to do for professional wrestling what NBA Jam had done for professional basketball. Short, flashy matches with outlandish animations and commentary. It used digitized sprites for the wrestlers and crowd, and used over-the-top animations for its moves. When it was brought home, everything under the sun got a version of it. Whether you owned a Super Nintendo, Genesis, PC, PlayStation, Saturn, or even a 32X, there was a version just for you. While these versions varied in quality and closeness to the arcade, they all still had some degree of that crazy gameplay. It took a number of cues from the Mortal Kombat games besides the digitized graphics. Each title mode featured some form of handicap match that often pitted you against 2 or more opponents, and there was a competitive and co-op tag team mode as well. It's fairly inexpensive on many platforms, except of course the Saturn and 32X versions. If you have a PlayStation though, that's the version you want. In 1997, All Japan Pro Wrestling featuring Virtua was released on the Sega Saturn and the Titan STV arcade platform. This was a 3D polygonal game with mainly Japanese wrestlers, but there were a handful of American guys old school fans will recognize. There's also 2 of the Virtua Fighter guys here, Jeffrey and Wolf. It was a highly technical wrestling title with a ton of moves and customization, and it had a breakneck speed that served its arcade roots well. It heavily relied on a first-come, first-served grappling system that allowed you to control the flow of the match, both inside and out of the ring. You had your standard counters, of course, but mastering the grapple was the bread and butter of doing well. It also had a really cool mechanic of being able to target certain parts of your opponent's body. You could work on his knee or back and then try and submit him with a move that damaged that area further. It made for an extremely technical wrestler that was quite a step up from the stuff we'd seen the previous generation. I really like the sound and visual presentation as well. If you're looking for a Saturn fighting game with something a little bit different, this one is your best bet. In 1989, everything changed for arcade wrestling games. WWF Superstars from Technos Japan made its way into the wrestling genre. First, we had a fully licensed product that had both the visual appeal of the WWF as well as wrestlers that sported their trademarked personas. Second, we had gameplay that was as easy and as natural to pick up as anything before it. And lastly, we had audio that sounded like it was a TV broadcast. Add all that up and you have one of the best wrestling games ever made. Your job here is simple: win the WWF Tag Team Championship. The problem? You have to go through other wrestlers like the Honky Tonk Man, the Ultimate Warrior, and Hacksaw Jim Duggan before you meet the Megabucks combo of Andre the Giant and the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase. The grappling system is simple, and combined with your striking and running attacks, gave you a great arsenal to mess around with. There's multiplayer, of course, and you can even bash your opponent with a steel chair if you so desire. WWF Superstars wasn't the first great arcade wrestling game, but it was definitely a game changer with that WWF license in tow. Sometimes a game just comes along at the right time and place in your life that you never forget it. One of those games for me was 1985's Mania, the Pro Wrestling Network. This Technos Japan developed and Taito published wrestling game landed at my yellow cab depot, and it was love at first sight. I didn't know how to play it worth a damn in the beginning, but it was just so engaging visually, and those iconic sound effects drew you in and hooked you for the long haul. Mania wasn't licensed by any real-life organizations. In fact, it used a made-up one called the Taito Wrestling Association. The colorful wrestlers included guys like the Insane Warrior, Coco Savage, and the Golden Hulk. Your job was to fight your way through the challengers, defeat the champion, and then defend that title. The gameplay was based on a simple grappling mechanic that allowed you to body slam, suplex, or send your opponent into the ropes for a few other moves like a clothesline. It was unbelievably solid for a game made in that era, and it captured me and my friends for months. We got so good we could play for a good while on a single quarter, trading off match to match until one of us lost. I still hear the referee's muffled cries of 1, 2, 3 as I sit here thinking about my 10-year-old self standing there trying to win that championship. In 1993, both the Genesis and Super Nintendo received WWF Royal Rumble. This was a sequel to the rather average WWF Super Wrestlemania, and man was it an improvement in every way. The visuals were better, the sound was better, and the gameplay saw some big improvements in movesets and speed. It had the usual assortment of modes like single matches and tag team contests, but it was the Royal Rumble that made this game what it was. With 6 wrestlers in the ring at once, it was a free-for-all of survival. The aim was to throw out as many of your opponents as possible, while keeping yourself from being tossed along the way. It had the wrestlers' finishing moves as well, a super important addition to humiliate your fallen friends. The visuals were detailed, the music faithful, and it had the top WWF wrestlers at the time. The two versions did have some roster differences. The Super Nintendo traded Ric Flair, Mr. Perfect, Ted DiBiase, Yokozuna, and Tatanka for Hulk Hogan, IRS, Jim Duggan, The Model, and Papa Shango on the Genesis. That was okay because that great Royal Rumble mode was still fully intact. Even today I fire it up to battle my daughter for ring supremacy. It's fast, simple fun, and one of the best retro wrestling experiences out there. A sequel named WWF Raw was done for this as well, and it plays very much the same. As good as WWF Superstars had been, 1991's WWF Wrestle Fest was that much better. Again by Technos Japan, this builds on the formula set by the previous game and adds bigger, bolder, and more colorful graphics, a more realistic audio experience, and quite possibly the best arcade gameplay the genre had ever seen. Massive sprites filled the screen in both Royal Rumble and the tag matches. The former was essentially a survival mode against the computer, while the latter was a tournament-style competition to get a chance at the Legion of Doom for the belts. The wrestlers not only looked like their real-world counterparts, but they moved like them and had their finishing moves. You could use the likes of Hulk Hogan, the Ultimate Warrior, $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase, the Big Boss Man, Jake the Snake Roberts, Earthquake, Mr. Perfect, Sergeant Slaughter, and the tag team of Demolition. It was up to 4 players at once and easily one of the best arcade games ever made. The grappling system was easy to understand and execute, and the double team moves added great variety to the co-op and competitive multiplayer. There was no greater thrill in these kinds of games than seeing the Road Warriors come down that aisle and give you a shot at the titles.
We snack on danger, dine on death. You barely every turtle face thing we say. Yeah! Oh no!
In 1998, THQ published the Asmik and AKI joint, WCW NWO Revenge. Building off of the previous release of WCW vs NWO World Tour, this was point blank one of the most complete wrestling simulators on the market. Loaded with both the big-name WCW talent at the time and a list of guys there just for beatdown fodder, there was no shortage of personalities to play. You also had the ability to customize quite a bit about each and every wrestler. You could rename them, completely change their costumes, and their colors. There are pay-per-view arenas like Halloween Havoc and Starrcade here, and of course you have various championship modes and a Royal Rumble to keep you entertained. The appeal of the Nintendo 64 wrestling titles were almost entirely their grappling system, which featured both a weak and strong format that led into a huge assortment of offensive and counter moves. Add in 4-player co-op and competitive play, and you have a wrestling game that defined an entire generation for WCW fans. There is just so much to see and do here. You can battle on the concrete floor with weapons, you can cheat your ass off in tag matches. I mean, you can get a few friends together and have something here with near endless replay value. Its lone weakness is the lack of proper entrance music. 2000's WWF No Mercy was the last of the Nintendo 64 Asmik and AKI developed wrestling titles, and it was one for the ages. Take everything I just said about WCW NWO Revenge, and it's a bit better here in just about every way. The roster is bigger and better, the customizations are better, there are more match types, it's got each wrestler's entrance music and the videos to accompany them. It's just a perfect package of wrestling action. Thankfully, we still have the 4-player co-op and competitive multiplayer, and the killer Royal Rumble mode is still here as well. This is basically the evolution of the previous title, WrestleMania 2000, bigger, badder, and better looking. The sheer volume of match types is guaranteed to keep even the most diehard fan of the sport busy, and that classic grappling system is now better than ever, with more moves and counters than ever before. I had been a big fan of WrestleMania 2000, and it actually took me a while to warm up to this one because I thought it more of the same. It was in many ways, of course, but the improvements can't be denied. As far as Attitude Era wrestling goes, this one is second to none. It's got the wrestlers, the match types, the multiplayer, and that grappling system honed to absolute perfection. I play it often today, and it endures with such a large fan base, there are even tons of visual and gameplay hacks you can download for it. This one simply has no mercy on the competition. Wrestling games were a fantastic source of multiplayer fun for me and my friends. Staying up all night bashing each other with chairs and delivering pile drivers on the concrete floor were some of my best gaming memories. They were often easy to play button mashers where anything could happen. While I have long since left wrestling sports entertainment behind, I still have a soft spot for these titles that soaked up so much of my time as a youth. I can still sit and play most of them today with no problems at all, and I always get a kick out of how mad my wife and daughter get when the beatdown begins. If you have family and friends around that like to play games, I guarantee you will find few better competitive and co-op multiplayer options in retro gaming. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.